Good evening, and welcome to our Global Conversation Literacy with Dr. Sharon Murphy. We are hosting tonight from Georgia State University, located in downtown Atlanta.
Your moderators for this evening will be Dr. Peggy Albers, Professor of Language and Literacy at Georgia State University, Ryan Boylan, and myself, Nicole Dukes, both doctoral students at Georgia State University.
Sorry, we just had a little bit of a glitch here.
Global Conversations in Literacy Research consists of online interactive web seminars with the intent to circulate cutting-edge research in the fields of literacy and language arts. We are currently conducting research on the nature of technology-mediated interactions between and among participants within the literacy-focused web seminars. We invite you to participate by taking our online survey or volunteering to be interviewed following a web seminar.
We want you to feel free to interact during the presentation. You may do this by typing in the chat area any questions and responses you may have during the webinar.
Dr. Murphy's research interests include assessment and literacy learning. Her current research involves the development of an approach to assessment that is motivated by ethical and epistemological considerations. Among her major accomplishments are that she has served as an educational consultant with the Newfoundland Government's Learning Center, and that she has developed a handbook for teachers and students with difficulties in reading and writing. Dr. Murphy is currently serving as a professor in the Faculty of Education at York University in Toronto, Canada. She has served as the director of the graduate program and the associate dean of faculty for graduate studies at York. Among her many publications are Literacy Education Through Language Arts, Telling Pieces, Art Literacy in Middle Grade Classes, Fragile Evidence, Critique of Reading Assessment, and Report Card on Basal Readers. A more complete biography is available on the GCLR website.
Now, without further ado, it is my honor and pleasure to introduce Dr. Sharon Murphy and her presentation entitled Ethically Based Literacy Assessment Within a New Literacy Framework. Let's give her a virtual round of applause by clicking the hand icon, which is located on your screen underneath the participant window.
Okay. Okay, Sharon, you can go amidst all those little sounds of the hand clapping. Go right ahead.
Okay, welcome everyone, and thank you so much for letting me join in this lovely initiative of Peggy Albers to cross oceans and borders to talk about literacy. Let me give you a little overview of what I'm going to discuss. First, I'm going to talk to you about what I mean about ethically based assessment. Then I'm going to look at PISA and new literacy studies from the perspective of that assessment. And one little note before we begin. The photos you see are all publicly available Microsoft photos, and they're just intended as visual gestures towards the topic at hand. They don't actually come from any of the studies or the work referenced. So first of all, let's start with my ideas for a conceptual basis to assessment. This is where I want to pull the lens far back from the ways we usually talk about assessment to look at some foundational elements. Typically, when we talk about assessment, we focus on method. So, for example, people will discuss whether a test is standardized, norm-referenced, criterion-referenced. They'll talk about the kinds of materials that are contained in portfolios and how those materials represent the individual in relation to what's being assessed. They'll also talk about things like whether the assessment is formal, like a tuxedo, or informal, like an old pair of jeans, or formative, like an unshaped sand structure, or summative, like the defined castle you see here. Less common, I believe, is talk about what assessment is conceptually and how it plays a role in everyday lives. operating under the radar as we go about our days. This is the place I want to begin. I believe that it is in thinking about the everydayness of assessment that we can learn about the properties of assessment that might be used to inform educational assessments. I believe we engage in numerous acts of assessment on a daily basis, and that as language users we have an innate propensity to assess. So let's start thinking about our human inclination to use language. Catherine Snow's studies of the development of the semantic system in young children can help us here. She talks about what she calls the acquisition of shared meaning. We humans, it seems, work with what are called functionally core patterns. We move from these functionally core patterns to make hypotheses about what to include and exclude as part of a pattern. In other words, we make a judgment. We engage in an act of assessment. Let's take the case of young Alice, a 16-month-old who I had the pleasure of interacting with in a doctor's waiting room recently. Alice was busying herself, wandering from here to there as young children do. She was walking in that somewhat wobbly way that children her age do when they're mastering the art of walking. Alice had also managed to master a few words, one of which she demonstrated as she walked up to an empty wooden chair, patted it, and said, "Cha," to which her mother said something like, "Yes, that's a chair." Alice then wobbly walked to another couple of wooden chairs across the room. She tapped the seat of those chairs and declared these as "cha" as well. Alice was on her way back across the room when something distracted her. Now, if you are someone new to the act of walking, distractions can only mean one thing: a loss of balance and a plopping onto the floor. So Alice fell flat on her bottom onto the floor, at which point she used each of her hands to pat the floor beside her and pronounce "cha." I smiled, as it seemed to me that Alice had indeed found herself a convenient chair in the form of the floor. Of course, her mother intervened with a comment like, "Oh, you fell on the floor," and pretty soon Alice was off wobbly walking again to find some new thing to think about. In this little episode of perhaps a minute or two, I believe that Alice was engaging in assessment. She was working with a functionally core pattern of chairness, which seemed to have something to do with the action of sitting or seating, and perhaps woodenness. But her pattern seemed not to have to do so much with the physical properties of a chair, such as legs or a seat. When Alice fell on her bottom and patted the floor, she used her judgment to determine whether what she landed upon fitted her idea of chairness. And, aha! In Alice's mind, she had indeed landed quite conveniently on a chair. As a language user, as someone interested in patterns, Alice was working out similarities and differences for chairness. Her mother's comments about the floor is illustrative of the fact that our pattern making is often socially mediated. Here's a slightly different example of the social mediatedness of pattern making. If you look at the plant depicted on the screen, some of you may think of it as a pretty flower, and others of you may think of it as a nuisance, a weed to be extracted from front lawns and backyards. Interestingly enough, even though some of us might well identify the blossom of the dandelion plant as a weed in one context, if a child like Alice pointed to it, well, we might respond to Alice by saying something like, "Pretty flower," something we would never dream of in another context. This illustrates the influence of values on assessment. We are social beings. We are prepared to negotiate the boundaries of our pattern making based on our values, which usually include a desire to belong to a social group. When we identify with a social group, we pattern make in similar ways as the group does. Our values also depend on affect. The degree to which we care for young children may sometimes make us abandon our adult ways and respond to them as they enter into our shared common world. What does all of this have to do with educational assessment, you might wonder? Well, just as we exercise judgment and values in naming the world, we use judgment and values in educational assessment. However, in the field of education, assessment typically has an added element. In education, we are quite deliberate about assessment much of the time. We also deliberate quite a bit about creating assessments and figuring out their meanings. Sometimes we announce ahead of time what and how we are going to assess, and other times we may do so after the fact. These features of being deliberate, of spending considerable time contemplating the what and the how of assessment, these features complicate educational assessment because they mean that we design assessments. Design, then, is an added defining feature of assessment in education. The graphic designer, Alex White, tells us that to design means to plan. Planning, of course, makes us ask questions of purpose. What's an assessment for? Structure. How is it formed and organized? Material elements. What are its constituent parts? What is the physical material of the assessment? What is its location? The study of design in architecture has taught us that we are, for better or worse, different people in different places. By extrapolation, then, when design becomes part of a literacy assessment, we may be one kind of literate being within one design and a different kind in a different design. Design, by definition, then, has both positive and negative elements. It enables, but it also limits. In educational assessment, we've seen the enabling and limiting forces of design over and over again when contradictory presentations of an individual's literacy are represented in different literacy assessments. Denny Taylor at Hofstra, or my colleague at York University, Carol Ann Ween, or Arlette Willis at the University of Illinois are among the many who've commented on such issues. When we try to make sense of or see literacy by using a specific assessment design, each assessment design houses a vision of literacy. Sometimes the vision of literacy represented in the design is quite mere, because the design of the house is conceptually small, with perhaps only one room or maybe two rooms of thought. An example of this might be an assessment that names itself as a literacy assessment, but turns out to be a test of alphabet knowledge or of sound symbol relationships. Other times, the vision of literacy is quite generous, with a diversity of spaces and interconnections. Examples of such assessments might be those which allow for many genres of texts, many modalities, and many functions of literacy to be considered. We also know that different houses for literacy assessment may be needed depending upon the climate in which the houses are built, and this too must be considered. Just like one does not attempt to build an igloo in a tropical climate, one cannot build a literacy assessment that bears no relationship to the literacy engagements of a particular culture. If housing or design has such a strong impact on our ability to know literacy through assessment, it seems to me that our construction of literacy assessments must be based upon some principles of conduct. I have encapsulated the essence of these principles of ethically informed assessment into the simple phrase, knowing well and doing well. I have come to these principles by reading the work of the philosopher Lorraine Code. She is interested in the idea of how human beings act responsibly in relation to knowledge, or, as she would say, how they demonstrate epistemic responsibility. One of the people she looks to as an example of someone working at the intersection of knowing well and doing well is Rachel Carson, known for her work in getting DDT banned. Code argues that most so-called knowledge is really well-warranted belief. If you think back to our little Alice, her actions in naming the floor as a conveniently situated chair were based on belief informed by her 16 months' worth of encounters with the world. She offers an argument or a claim about chairness when she pats the floor and declares it to be a chair. When little Alice sits on the floor and proclaims, "Cha," she is making what Lorraine Code would call an epistemic claim. She's claiming to know something, and she's patting the floor as part of her argument. When we engage in education, we make a claim about literacy, and we must metaphorically pat the floor. We must make an argument to provide evidence to support our claim. However, Crode argues it's not enough to know well to warrant or to provide evidence and argument about a claim. Rather, we have ethical obligations about the claims we make and the actions based on those claims. To again go back to little Alice to help us think, what are the consequences of her claim? What would happen if all floors were chairs? Would we find people randomly sitting on every floor space in malls and synagogues and churches, on the bus? What would be the consequences of such actions to other aspects of life? Would people begin to see every flat surface as an invitation for sitting? How would her claims relate to other claims of chairness? Would chairs become expensive space-cluttering devices? What might Alice's naming of a floor as a chair mean to someone seeking a chair? Would chairs become passé? Of course we can't go off into the world making random claims. Chaos would ensue. Our assessment actions demand scrupulousness. Lorraine Code argues that to act in an epistemically responsible fashion, we must first know well, and only then can we do well as a result of our knowing. Being scrupulous in knowing well and doing well does not mean that we all have to be uniform. Rather, knowing well and doing well mean that in an assessment, as elsewhere in life, we must be mindful of particular contexts within particular communities. For Alice, chairness in Toronto society has certain implications, which may not be the same for other parts of the world. The strength of our stance is its care and attentiveness to the particular, and to being mindful of the climate in which we are operating. To elaborate more on knowing well and doing well in literacy assessment, I will first turn to an example of assessment found in educational circles. That assessment was created under the auspices of the OECD, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, and is referred to as PISA, which stands for the Program for International Student Assessment. Going back to design principles, I'm going to start with purpose as a point of departure. What is the purpose of PISA? What prospects does it offer? One declaration of the purpose of PISA can be found on the PISA website. If you read this statement, PISA can do what pretty well no assessment has done before. Not only can it see into the future, but it can see into the far distant future. The statement speaks for itself. Are students well prepared for future challenges? Can they analyze, reason, and communicate effectively? Do they have the capacity to continue learning throughout life? The OECD Program for International Student Assessment answers these questions and more through its surveys of 15-year-olds in the principal industrialized countries. Every 3 years, it assesses how far students near the end of compulsory education have acquired some of the knowledge and skills essential for full participation in society. Now, you might be forgiven if you thought that perhaps you were reading an article in a popular entertainment magazine that also included quizzes helping you identify your soulmate, the best informant for you, or the type of personality you have. And for those of you in the United States, you might be saying something like, yes, and I have a bridge in San Francisco that I can sell you. Yet, these are the proclamations of PISA, a large-scale test used across numerous nations for several years, now costing nation-states multi-millions of dollars. In fact, if state-based statistics in the United States were gathered using PISA, the estimated cost for the United States for PISA would be about $25 million. In 2009, Canada paid $2.4 million in actual direct costs for each of the previous years of PISA's testing cycle, with indirect costs being borne by the provinces. If you multiply these kinds of costs across participating nations, and you will quickly come to see that PISA is a multi-million-dollar enterprise. And that's just counting direct costs. Indirect costs, with teacher time for administration, regional management time, and so on, add even more to the estimates, not merely in dollars, but in the loss of educational activities being replaced by PISA. The PISA website pronouncement of purpose suggests that you don't have to open the cover of a test booklet or a technical manual to see that scrupulousness in advertising is not quite part of the PISA way. Hyperbole appears more in keeping with some aspects of this assessment. That, in and of itself, should send signals of caution. Maybe, you might say, the problem is not a PISA problem, but a marketing problem. Perhaps PISA is a more modest instrument and is more attentive to what it claims. This gets us to the question of how PISA was formulated. Think about it. PISA is a test for the world, so it would seem only right and fitting that the world be invited to participate in its formation. And if you read the technical manuals, you will find that indeed participating nation-states could and did send delegates to make representations with respect to the design of PISA, a sign of scrupulousness. Indeed, it sounds wonderful until you read one report of what making representations with respect to the design of the assessment actually entailed. How did PISA keep faith with participating nation-states, which presumably had an interest in representing literacy from the perspective of their communities of practice? Scottish researchers Grech, Lunn, and Osga were curious about the PISA planning and design meetings, so they interviewed representatives who participated in such meetings. They reported that the meetings tended to be more about managing nation-states into consensus than representing particularity. The effect of being managed was that questions representing cultural differences were made to disappear. Technical presentations replete with complex statistics focusing on the reduction of diversity effectively silenced participants who had to trust that the statistics could somehow massage differences across school systems and cultures into some kind of meaningful assessment. This kind of silencing is an example of what Proctor calls agnotology, the cultivation of ignorance. By presenting a complicated statistics far removed from an ordinary person's sense of assessment, people are led to a certain direction because they don't understand what they're presented with, and they are content to leave such matters up to the experts, sort of like the case of the emperor's new clothes in a way. Okay, you might say, maybe the test items are constructed in a manner that conceives of a global culture for 15-year-olds and anticipates futures for them. After all, with new media, the world has become a much smaller place. If global culture were somehow represented, then one might consider that an indicator of scrupulousness. However, when I looked at PISA technical manuals, I found no substantive discussion of the contemporary or projected literacy practices of the lives of 15-year-olds. Not only that, it seemed that for a subset of items at least, knowledge about today's adults was what counted, since these items were borrowed directly from an adult literacy test. This is where the logic of PISA really begins to break down. If PISA is so forward-looking, why is it using the practices of today's adults as a marker? My guess is that the techno-literacy practices of many 15-year-olds would be a far better forecaster of the future than what today's middle-aged adults are doing. One researcher, Rocher, interviewed PISA test takers about the questions they had just completed, and, no surprise here, he found that teenagers thought quite differently about what some questions were testing than did the people who designed the correct answers to the PISA test. Perhaps you might suggest in the technical manuals PISA developers reflected on these issues. But while PISA something is happening to my screen. I have to stop here for a minute.
Yes, I don't know what happened.
Okay, sorry. Perhaps,
hold on.
I've just moved it out of the way. I can see what I'm doing. I don't know if other people can move it out of the way.
Yes, I'm not sure. Somebody's sharing their screen with us, and I'm not quite sure who.
Okay.
So let me see if we can get this taken care of, Sharon.
But I'll just keep going on. Shall I?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead, Sharon.
Okay. All right. Perhaps you might suggest In the technical manuals, PISA developers reflected on these issues. But while PISA developers expressed some reservations about things like the comparability of translated versions of PISA, on the whole they tend to be very self-congratulatory on other matters, in a look what we've managed to do kind of way. They were admittedly opportunistic by including test items from the adult literacy scale just so they could compare populations, rather than being worried about how these items really didn't serve the articulated purpose of PISA. The consequences of PISA, whether real or psychological, have appeared through the revamping of educational systems as in Germany, and the descriptions of successful systems such as Finland or Shanghai, with an implicit view that somehow emulation of such successful systems can occur without strong attention to context and circumstance. I could go on about PISA. The point is, however, that PISA test developers did not act in an epistemically responsible way. They did not make what I think are solid efforts to know well. As far as doing well, the prospect of doing well has to be in relation to knowing well, and therefore for me it falls to the wayside, even though, as I suggest, PISA overreaches here as well. I'll make a shift now and consider knowing well and doing well with respect to assessment within a new literacy framework. First of all, let me acknowledge that new literacy studies are hardly new, and they've been augmented by ideas such as multimodal literacy. That being said, new literacy studies still provide an anchor for much of our thinking about literacy. Brian Street describes new literacy studies as studies which treat language and literacy as social practices rather than technical skills to be learned in formal education, and take account of the context and its different meanings for different cultural groups. This definition would imply, then, that many educational assessments turn literacy into an object existing apart from any context, and so such assessments do not fit within the new literacy studies umbrella. Standardized assessments are particularly problematic and surface usually only in terms of the consequences they have for participants. Examples of new literacy in studies include the study of literacy in many different contexts. For example, a community of Lancaster in England, livestock auctions, preparation for Holy Communion in one Catholic parish, digital gaming, children writing, children engaged in school project work, and children's literacy learning in South Africa. So, does assessment fit at all within a new literacy studies perspective? And if so, how? Tillman suggests that the idea of assessment per se fundamentally opposes the idea of communities of practice upon which the new literacy studies are based. And Romer elaborates this position by saying we cannot speak about the assessment of individual knowledge because knowledge cannot be located inside the head of the individual, but is distributed across the whole community of practice. As the illustration suggests, knowledge exists in a web of interconnectedness. But other new literacy study writers, such as Pardo, suggest that literacy involves practices that are already very firmly divided up as either right or wrong, adequate or inadequate, successful or unsuccessful, dominant or marginal. Our society has already created views of acceptable literacy practices in relation to specific literacy engagements. According to Pardo, the documentation of the why and how of literacy acts can show how certain practices, categorized as non-standard or low status, can turn out to be highly functional and even highly rational in different social contexts. Pardo's position provides one point of departure for thinking about assessment within new literacy studies. That is, within new literacy studies, literacy assessment is not so much concerned with what literacy is, the skills of literacy, but is concerned with what literacy does. This type of assessment is referred to as impact assessment. Classification of skills and abilities gives way to the purpose of the assessment being focused on what literacy enables and what it limits. As such, something like struggles with literacy are, in Barton and Hamilton's words, part of everyone's experience and not just a problem that resides in a particular group of outsiders without literacy. Let's think about impact assessment for a moment. In this perspective, literacy itself is not an object but a process. So how can you know well and do well in relation to a process? First of all, in impact assessment, what's important is knowing how literacy engagements are part of people's lives and developing a sense of the significance of those engagements. Scrupulousness in knowing is governed by how well the observer, researcher, or teacher develops a sense of the participant's experience of living in the world. It is complicated by the participant's willingness to disclose, to provide artifacts, commentary, information, and perceptions. Knowing well here rests on the twofold storying or narrativization design of the new literacy studies. One type of narrativization of life occurs as participants disclose through interviews, documents, and actions their literacy encounters. A re-narrativization of these disclosures is then made through the researcher's construction and theorization of the meaning, motives, and sometimes consequences of the stories. So, for instance, in Barton and Hamilton's classic study of local literacies, Harry's beliefs about his literacy are cast against his personal tale of not being well educated. A different literacy story is suggested by Harry's strategies for finding his way up the promotional ladder by using already existing models of incident reports of firefighting and eventually molding them to his own purpose. For Harry, literacy's impact is enabling. He uses prototypes to help him attain position and then moves beyond them. June's tale is one of the integration of literacy into her everyday as she chooses gift cards for her boss, reads the community newsletter, does the accounts at home, reads magazines, and makes travel arrangements, a set of literacy practices which she uses to get things done. She doesn't go out of her way to do things with literacy, and it doesn't particularly interest her. In short, from an impact perspective, June's tale is much like a stone skimming across the water, touching the surfaces, but not the depths. In the impact assessment of new literacy studies, knowing well and doing well is not knowing well about literacy in the abstract, but it is knowing it in the context of action, in the context of the particular. The material elements of impact assessment within new literacy studies come from the particular. New literacy studies speak compellingly because they speak of place and person in a manner that is recognizable and knowable in some way to each of us. We are caught up in the stories. The multiple data points are seductive and are a metaphorical patting of the floor because they seem to bolster claims that we do indeed know well about the participants. However, the consequences of impact assessment operate at several levels. At the simplest level, the question is whether the literacy allowed participants to do what needed to be done in a specific context. And maybe here the answer depends upon the reader, since the answer is embedded within the narratives, and the narratives are stories which are read, interpreted, and made sense of. A more complicated question arises from the stories, and that is whether participants' knowledge of their literacy engagements, as seen or read through new literacy studies, has its own set of consequences for participants. The ethical positioning of researchers here is an interesting one. By making the impact of literacy practices more visible, the researchers may well set the seeds for and be implicated in changing a social practice. So even though the storying of literacy engagements fits well with the importance of context within an epistemically responsible view of assessment, questions are also provoked. Added to these issues is that for Western societies, it seems preposterous that literacy could somehow depend upon context and communities and be untied from individuals. Such an idea flies in the face of long-established educational practices of representing an individual's literacy abilities by a single number or alphabet letter, or representing a grade in the same way, even though sometimes group work, interestingly, is represented within that grade. This raises the large question of who the individual is within a community of practice. Romer believes that not only are trajectories of the individuals within communities important, but when you trace those trajectories, one finds undertones of the right or proper way of speaking or acting within communities of practice. Indeed, to some extent, that is what a community of practice is, a place where conserving and inventing forces come into tension. Think about Harry's use of model reports for firefighting, mentioned earlier. This tension is easier to reveal in studies of apprenticeship, where there are explicitly recognized people who know more of the community's practices than other people. Pippa Stein and Lynn Slaminski's study of multimodal literacy in 3 Johannesburg families is an example of such new literacy studies research. In this study, 3 different instances of literacy apprenticing are described. In one case, the case of Dineo, the father's concern with Dineo's reading is its intonational contours, especially given the relationship of intonation in terms of the language being read. And you can see an example on the screen of Dineo and his father reading the Sesotho language, and Dineo pronounces some words incorrectly, and the father corrects her pronunciation. In the second case, you'll see Puleng and her grandmother. In this instance, Puleng's grandmother is very interested in the meaning of what's being read and its implications for Puleng's daily living. So in the first excerpt, you see Granny saying, in response to a story, her best friend was, and Puleng saying Felicity, so that's a kind of a meaning check. And in the second instance, Granny is trying to help Puleng extrapolate from the story. She says, Fiona had a real problem. She couldn't remember anything. Can you see? Puleng says, yes. And Granny says, can you remember all your things before you go to school? In the third case, the case of Margot and her aunt, the focus seems to be on the purpose of the activity, buying a house, rather than literacy per se. So you see Margot turning the page of this real estate news material, and she says, look at this one, Mom, it's good, hey? And her Aunt Kathy says, yes, she thinks it's a bit expensive. Margot asks how she knows. Kathy says she can see the price. Margot asks where that price is and asks Kathy to show her. And Kathy says, no, that's not the price. That says the name of the estate agent. Each of these 3 little instances contains language that is indicative of a less knowledgeable person being apprenticed into a right way of being literate. The adults orient or reorient the children. In Dineo's case, through correction, in Puleng's case, through questioning, and in Margot's case, through a reorienting response. The participants of the literacy engagement are exercising values to make judgments about what is good enough at this moment of the child's apprenticeship to literacy. They are operating from a conceptualization of what literacy is, as some kind of object out there, and from a conceptualization of what literacy does. That is, it affords one participation in the community or communities to which one's belonging is important. They are holding in mind knowing well and doing well together in relation to their perception of context. Recall in the story I told you about little Alice at the beginning of this talk, remember her overgeneralization of chairness was corrected, presumably to orient Alice towards becoming a member of the community of speakers of which her family was a part. Now, academics also have epistemic communities in which they too have socially agreed upon sets of values and dispositions for how to be in the world. As I've already said, epistemic communities inevitably are faced with an inherent tension, an epistemological paradox of sorts. In order to grow and evolve, they cannot always look inward and be conserving. They cannot freeze the ways in which they know. Rather, there must be room for novelty and change, which may be brought about by individual actions within collectives. Sometimes the novelty means minor adjustments to social practices. Sometimes it means no adjustment, and other times the reach of the new is phenomenal. Theoretically, once we get to the issue of more or less knowledgeable people and an idea of rightness and properness, we are raising a host of issues. First of all, the object and subject of assessment will have to be reintroduced. There is an underlying knowledge here which is good enough, and that knowledge becomes manifest in an instance of practice. There is also someone who is striving to become a participant in conventional practices, sometimes giving up individualism and other times working to maintain it so as to create anew. Layered on top of the context of a literacy event is the issue of location, positioning, and power of the assessor. In Stein and Slominski's examples, consider the positioning and power of the immediate assessor, the parents and caregivers. In each of these cases, the more knowledgeable other who is assessing the less knowledgeable other is doing so not with a view to categorization, but with a view towards conventional practice. There is a nestling of the practices here directly within lived practices of the community. What happens when the values and judgment exercised are not those of the community? What is the interest of the assessor in such a case? And how do benefits accruing the assessor interact with what they see? The question that must be asked of all assessors, whether new literacy studies folk or not, is whether they can be dissatisfied with their own ways of talking about assessment. If they can be open to being discontented by examining other vocabularies from their own perspective, they may gain insight. The work of assessment, with its rootedness in values, judgment, and design, can be so oriented towards foreclosure that it demands an openness that assessors be attentive to building a generous house for literacy, or perhaps at least giving meaningful consideration to the kind of assessment they have built. To wrap up here, new literacy studies certainly offer room for the examination of epistemological location and the consequences of that location with respect to assessment. There is a great deal of affinity between some of the concepts inherent in new literacy studies and in knowing well and doing well. Both are nestled within microcontexts, and new literacy studies sometimes seem to have an openness that is uncomfortable and even disquieting, but it is a positioned openness, and it is an openness that needs to be mindful of its material elements of listening and representing. What are the new horizons for new literacy studies? Is there room for growth in new literacy studies? Absolutely. One place to look is to Reggio Emilia teachers who work with artifacts, words, and images, just like new literacy studies researchers, but they do so through a pedagogical documentation process. In the Reggio Emilia work, the capacity for listening, the residues of engagement that are captured through words, images, and artifacts are seen as being marked by doubt and uncertainty, which in turn allows for the exploration of the space between the predictable and the unexpected. This tentativeness in the space between the predictable and unexpected might be one area for new literacy studies to explore. Also important is how the teachers using Reggio Emilia think about the ethical implications of documenting a life. Teacher Sandra Cheeseman says, "We acknowledge that the experience is shared. However, the power of the adult can dominate here as decisions are made about how children's ideas are interpreted, questioned, or represented within the documentation." She goes on to say, "I often wonder whether we steal from children, their ideas, their hypotheses, and their wisdom." In closing, I want to note that in the past I've said that all assessments are flawed in some way and no assessment is perfect, and I still hold to this view. But I believe that it means that we must be critical, or as critical, about our own representations of literacy as we are of the representations of others. We must look to new ideas to find new materials in which to build assessment that house literacy in more generous ways. And we must be mindful that the houses we build say a lot about who we are and what we care about. And with that, I think we're off to new horizons, and I want to thank you very much for listening. Okay.
Okay, thank you, Sharon. We'd like to thank Sharon, and what we'd like to invite our audience to do now is to type in any questions that they would like Sharon to respond to. Please do that in the chat area. And it looks like, do we have a question that somebody wants to ask Sharon? If we would give, what we have is, I think we have a little confusion between the virtual hand clap, Sharon, and the hand to raise for questions, which is always great. So I'm not quite sure if we have a question or not. Sharon, I would like to start your question response. And we've got a number of teachers in our audience tonight. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more specifically about what teachers might think about in reconceptualizing what some of these assessments could be that you've envisioned. Because quite frankly, this is really it's a very theoretical piece that has lots of implications for teaching. So would you mind talking to that a little bit?
Well, I do think that a great model is the Reggio model. I think it's hard to kind of translate that over into classroom practice. But I have to say that I recently sat on a master's exam with a teacher who had done a wonderful job of doing just that. And what she'd done is, in the Reggio work, what you do is you take notes on what children say, you listen to what the children have to say, you take pictures, you gather artifacts, and you try and understand how children are making sense of their world, and you respond to them in a way that asks not them to account for themselves, but might provoke them to think a little bit. An example might be a thesis that I sat on where the teacher involved had a kid, they were doing weaving, and the child said to the teacher, "How do you weave a horse?" And the teacher obviously paused at this because this was a very unanticipated question, and she said, basically that she would have to think about that, and what did the child know about horses, and she got lots of books and materials to support the child's thinking about horses. In other words, what she did was she provided a rich context of materials, and from there, what she also did was she very carefully documented what happened, because she captured the child's series of drawings across a period of time, and you could see that child draw more and more sophisticated and detailed images of the horse, and he actually designed a horse that he wove. It's a very interesting thesis. But the point is here that most of the time, you know, in Ontario and I know in the United States, we're forced into trying to take literacy totally into the abstract. And what we've got to do is we've got to put literacy and literacy assessment back into contexts. Contexts that are rich, contexts that are complex, contexts that let you see children thinking on the spot rather than in response to a multiple choice bubble or some other kind of pressure. And the teacher who did the How to Weave a Horse study, she asked her principal to give her 2 hours a week so she could do what she called integrated studies. And this is where she documented this thinking. So it is possible, but it's very hard to do.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Sharon, to start us out. Pat wants to know, will you elaborate a little bit more on Harry's report on firefighters and the literacy practices it might represent and what that might look like?
Harry's report, that isn't my study. That's a study by Barton and Hamilton. And in that was a study that was documenting some of the things that you know, you would have to do in the employment, in your job as a firefighter. And Harry was uncomfortable with that work as I read the study. And in the beginning, what he did was he looked at other people's reports. So he looked at the kind of writing they did in there, and he basically copied it. You know, he just changed the, let's say, the names, dates, and locations to suit his purpose. But after a while, he kind of put his own personal touches on it. Now, I don't have a sense of the particulars of that because it isn't gone into in great detail in the study.
Thank you, Sharon. We have another one from Chayang, and Chayang wants to know, can you expand on the new directions of the new literacy studies, especially with multimodality research studies?
Well, I think that one of the things that new literacy studies make a commitment to is understanding literacy as a social practice. And when you look around the world today, you can see that we come to represent our world using lots of different modalities. We represent our world through drawing, through painting, through film, through audio broadcasts like this, through writing, and so on. So we use different kinds of modalities to represent our ideas and thinking. And when we think about literacy, sometimes we might be inclined to just think of it as words and paper. And what multimodalities does is it allows us to give expression to the broadest kinds of representations possible. So, and in the new directions of the new literacy studies, multimodalities are embraced as part of that kind of evolving understanding of what literacy is.
Sharon, I just have a quick little question about that. You had mentioned something about subject-object as part of the assessment. And does multimodality and the artifacts that are collected and maybe annotated by a teacher, do they get caught up in that subject-object definition that you referred to earlier?
Well, the subject-object thing is a kind of a very hard thing to think about because it means that you somehow, there is a way in which literacy representation is out there, and that we look at it and we say something is a good enough representation. It is separate from the practice, and you see that in studies of apprenticeship. Now, you know, any artifact, what happens in the new literacy studies usually is that every artifact is a story. And so even though the artifact is out there, it's inevitably a storied artifact. So it's always in this relationship with the person. And that's kind of what I'm trying to get at there when I talk about that.